which basically means that you need to have end-to-end visibility into your immediate supply chain, the supply chain of your tier one suppliers, as well as the supply chains of your tier two suppliers. And the reason this is important is because oftentimes the critical weaknesses lie multi-layer deep into multiple tiers. So how can you get there, right? So you basically need a multi-enterprise network tool, which provides you this end-to-end visibility across this multi-layer deep nodes of supply chain. And once you have this tool, you can have a control tower, right, which can get you understanding of the ins and flows of processes and your goods across the various supply chain nodes. You can get actionable insights. And essentially what it'll let you do is stress test your supply chain. And depending on what this stress test reveals, right, you can take adequate actions. Actions like Peter's talked about, it could be nearshoring, right? Or it could be finding an alternate supply for a critical product or opening a new warehouse to add more buffer, right? So those are some of the technology which can help with the broader supply chain. Now let's focus on the warehouses, right? To me, what I strongly believe in is you need a tier one WMS on cloud to cope up with this extreme variability.
Why cloud, Vish?
Cloud because, the on-prem solutions, they just cannot deal with this increased throughput. See, the only way you can handle this increased volume with on-prem solutions is if you throw more hardware at it. And sometimes it's not possible. And sometimes it's very, very expensive, right? And moreover, on cloud, the true cloud WMS systems like InfoWMS, it can automatically scale up and get more compute power as the transaction volume increases in the warehouse, right? So this concept of dynamic scaling is inherent in Info Cloud solution. Also, when it comes to security and fault tolerance, those are inbuilt in InfoWMS, right? So you don't need load balancing or additional hardware to be able to do that. And then, you don't need to maintain the cloud solutions, right? I mean, it's easily maintainable and it truly accounts for extreme variability. Also, a tier one WMS can easily connect with various kinds of automation in the warehouse. So when I say automation, these are traditional, bolt to the floor automation like pick-to-light system, conveyor systems, ASRS systems, which basically help handle this increased throughput. Or these could be newer technology like goods to person, AGVs, robotics, right? So essentially, a tier one WMS can easily integrate with this automation and get you to handle this increased volume. And then finally, InfoWMS, right? It has all the advanced features, task interleaving, labor management, yard visibility, cross-docking, value-added services, right? Which basically helps you achieve that perfect order fulfillment at lowest possible cost. And all of this while maintaining 99.9+% inventory accuracy at the warehouse bin level.
Excellent, Vish. Thank you for sharing that. I bet it makes your employees efficient as well in the warehouse. Switching to Monica, what are the efficiencies that come when your employees and customers have access to real-time data and a single source of the truth regarding inventory in motion?
Well, Adriana, let's consider first that as much as 80% of the information that companies need to efficiently manage inbound and outbound supply chain activities really sits outside their own businesses with external parties like their suppliers, their freight forwarders, 3PLs, the actual carriers moving their products, the customs brokers, trying to clear shipments in a timely fashion. connecting with all of these external parties to extract the current status of open orders, of planned shipments, orders in transit, when container vessels will be arriving into port, or when trucks will be arriving at dock doors. It's often a full-time job for certain employees in supply chain organizations. And they're using phone calls and emails, logging into carrier portals, or consulting port terminal data systems many times a day to collect this valuable information. And then they enter it into Excel spreadsheets, or they put it into a report format, and they distribute it to the stakeholders within their own organization, the inventory planners, the production planners, everyone who needs to know when things are going to be available in order to plan their next steps. This inherent inefficiency in the supply chain is just part of having to work with so many external providers. And when you're dealing in particular with suppliers and goods that have to travel across oceans, you put in a significant time element into the expectation or the lead cycle for products as well. If it's one thing if you have a supplier across the country that's going to ship something by truck or by parcel. It's quite another when you need to book a container slot on a vessel leaving from Shanghai or from a location in Singapore or from Japan, and arrange the landed drayage for that particular container of important parts when it comes in country, slotting that into the warehouse, delivery, appointment schedules. All of that complexity can really be overcome if companies take a network-centric view to connecting with their ecosystem of supply chain partners. Infor, and in particular the Infor Nexus platform, is designed specifically for that kind of a solution as a network platform that connects carriers, 3PLs, forwarders with the suppliers, with the customs brokers, and that can provide the enterprise with the first mile view of all of the multiple handoffs that go into moving goods across oceans. You have the opportunity to bypass the manual collection of information to make information entered at one point into the ecosystem available to all parties downstream that need to plan their activities in response to what's happening upstream. It takes delay and latency out of the process. It reduces error from having to transpose a phone call or an email response into an entry into a system of record in the ERP or supply chain software. The network approach, in particular to global logistics and connecting with your forwarders, getting in the space and confirmation of bookings for containers carrying important components, for instance. And with the arrival of those containers, the handoffs from different modes. When it comes from the ship and is unloaded at the terminal, it goes on to a truck and has to move to another facility, sometimes to a railhead, travels further overland before it gets to the next point at which it is perhaps deconsolidated or broken out, moved onwards. A network approach to connecting with all of these parties to bring in the automated status update information about these shipments in progress. Again, it takes out so much opportunity for error. It increases the real-time value of this information for the business because I think, as we all know, the health of a supply chain can be impacted in a moment's mishap. A fire on board a container vessel, or heavy seas that cause containers to be dropped overboard, a truck carrying important components involved in a traffic accident, a train of important components that is derailed and requires replenishment, scrambling to overcome these things. The earlier that companies know about this, the better their opportunity to mitigate this disruption, the more value this information has to all of the players in the component. Peter talked earlier about just-in-time. Just-in-time at a final assembly point, perhaps for the OEM, doesn't necessarily mean that every point in the upstream supply chain is able to react in a just-in-time process. There's certainly some manufacturing steps that just take months of planning and production capability, as well as extended travel times over oceans and across borders. The ability to see these processes end to end, to streamline the acquisition of data about the health of the supply chain and the state of shipments in motion, down to a line item level, to an order level. It's not enough nowadays just to know where the truck is or what's happening with it, or where that container is and what's happening with it. Companies need to know what orders are on that truck, what's in that trailer, which of my customers does this impact? Is it a part of my production lines? Is it to be drop shipped to our dealer network? All of this integrated capability, this broader picture of inventory in motion that's presented with business context for the stakeholders in the supply chain is made possible when you have a network platform like InfoNexus with native applications for global logistics, for visibility from supplier to final destination with predictive capabilities for when things will actually arrive at final destination, even when they're originating in countries thousands of miles away. This kind of elevated look at supply chain processes, the recognition that it is a multi-party, multi-enterprise problem and has to be addressed with multi-party, multi-enterprise technologies is, I think, perhaps one of the greatest opportunities for supply chain technology in automotive companies.
Monica, you kind of alluded to this a little bit with the stakeholders and some of the risks. Can you share how do companies reduce risk and or cost in both inbound and outbound shipping operations?
Well, the issues of risk and risk mitigation are, I think, top of mind for so many supply chain organizations today. And I think the answer really lies in trying to get as much visibility upstream in your supply partners and supply network ecosystem as possible, so that you give yourself more time as an organization to respond to disruption. There's no way you can hope to avoid all disruptions. There's no way you can predict all of them. As Fish mentioned earlier, the black swan event, as peculiar a term as that might be, the recognition that these things can arrive out of nowhere, that no amount of planning can predict something as comprehensive as a pandemic that disrupts global container flows, airline capacity, as well as ocean capacity for more than a year. But the sooner companies know about this, the more connected they are with their upstream supply chain partners, with their logistics service providers, the more they can respond in timely fashion, and the more options they have to mitigate disruption from these risks and upheavals in delivery to the final customer or to the final production facility. So it's you can't rely on hope as a strategy for success in life any more than you can as a strategy for success in supply chains. You have to know. And if you see the development of a late departure, delayed ocean capacity at an origin supply location on the other side of the Pacific, for instance, it's possible perhaps to plan a warehouse transfer or to go to a second tier source of that material, to use some of the redundancy that's built into your supply chain networks to fill that hole before it actually disrupts your end customer and your promise to them as perhaps a component in their supply chains as well. The visibility has to come from connectivity to many different systems, to many different providers. That shouldn't, however, be a burden for the IT systems of an automotive manufacturer. That's something that can be offloaded to a network application like InfoNexus and its platform design, where all parties around the world are connected only once to the platform, where the data that they put in for a customer only needs to be put in once. It can be accessed accessed by customers, by other parties in the supply chain over and over again for reference. It can be used for analytics, for planning, for prediction and forecasting with artificial intelligence going forward. But the essential thing is to digitalize the capture of that information and the interaction with your supply chain and trading partners up front to see how you can mitigate these things, to learn from past mistakes, to execute more swiftly each time around that you have to deal with an exception or a disruption. And it's only through using a more enlightened approach, a network approach, if you will, to your global logistics ecosystem that you really have this key to agility, to faster response, and to rapid adaptability in the face of disruption that hasn't been planned for.
Well said, Monica. Thank you for that. Peter, both Vish and Monica have shared perspectives on technology to the end of some of these unsettling times. Maybe you can share your perspective as we're coming to a close on how this can align to the industry, to the automotive industry.
Sure, so absolutely. And yeah, those are some great things that we heard there. And so what I want to do is just kind of sort of summarize it. And I want to talk about, so we've heard a lot about the technology aspects of it from a WMS perspective and from an Infor Nexus perspective. These are great solutions, of course, critical. But I also want to talk about some of the other aspects that, but at the end of the day, these are complex issues, right? And, whether you're an OEM, whether you're a supplier or any other type of partner in the network, everyone is basically seeking stability and predictability, right? That those elusive qualities, and of course, visibility goes towards achieving that ultimately, right? So a couple thoughts. Well, maybe more than a couple. So one of the key things, and we've touched on this, we've heard this earlier too, one of the key things that's going to have to undergird the whole thing is this concept of building trust, right? Now, there's many different ways to achieve that trust, obviously, with openness and transparency and communication, and there's enablers for all of those. But trust is a key thing to build into the system. The mitigation, again, you heard Monica just now also talk about mitigating risk, right? And what are some ways in which we can mitigate the risk? Because at the end of the day, that is, as we know, that is critical. And the technology is a key enabler in making this all happen. So whether it's our WMS, which Vish talked about, or whether it's the Infor Nexus solution, these work together. And of course, we've got other solutions. We've got a supply chain planning suite as well. So whatever the solution may be, the technology is a key enabler. And I think Monica touched on the concept of the digitization, right? I heard her say that. And I just want to touch on that, expand on that a little bit. We've all heard about digital transformation. We keep hearing that. It's a buzzword, right? But, when you think about it, what does that really mean? So just implementing a new system isn't digital transformation, because digital transformation really goes far beyond the technology. So yeah, technology is, of course, a key part of it. But digital transformation is, I guess if you want to consider this concept of from doing digital, which would be doing certain sort of tactical things to say, hey, I'm doing some digital, i.e. techie things, versus being digital, which being digital means sort of rewiring the organization's DNA and really changing ways of working, changing the way decisions are made, changing the way the entire organization interacts with its world, right? So that, there's a lot to unpack, which we won't get into here, but there's a concept of moving from doing to being digital. So that's a big part of the technology and beyond aspect. But to wrap it up, what I'd like to do is maybe share 6 things that companies could look at in order to, achieve some of the things that we talked about, right? So, okay, in no particular order, but just, so establishing cross-functional teams, right, is very important to make sure that information flows within the 4 walls of an organization effectively, and of course externally as well through like a multi-enterprise platform like a Nexus, right? But those cross-functional teams, and maybe with a control tower, a business control tower, that can increase an organization's sense and respond capability, right? That's a very important thing to consider. And we talked about risk, and the second one, we talked about risk management. So having a risk strategy and risk management and governance sort of plan and a way to make that happen, maybe a risk management quote unquote office or some protocols and some processes in place where there's a regular risk management and governance process. And as part of that, contingency planning, scenario planning, developing alternative sources of supply, and so on, right? So that's the second one. A third one would be relating to the organization. So, and I touched on this when I talked about digital DNA. So when you talk about changing an organization and making it flatter, so empowering decision-making at the lowest possible level where the decision needs to be made, that will improve response time, right? So changing the org structure, and that's a third piece of it. Is it the third? Yeah, I think it's the third. Going along with all of these are big changes. So you've got to have strong executive sponsorship, and you've got to have a very strong change management process, because all of these are really orders of magnitude, fundamental changes, right? In the way we do business and companies do business. Leveraging technology. And we talked about this, obviously, we talked about specifically some of our solutions here, cloud and analytics and artificial intelligence. These are different buzzwords that we've all heard about, and we all know what they mean. And of course, Infor has solutions in those spaces. But, as Vish talked about the scalability of cloud solutions and why that's important, right? And the whole concept, I believe Monica and Vish touched on this, the concept of data and how data is so key. And it's not just data, but it's good quality data and having a proper data governance strategy. So data is a big part of it, right? And then as you bring multiple parties together to share information and collaborate, you've got to have cybersecurity. Because if you don't have the cybersecurity, all it takes is one breach, and the trust just evaporates, right? So all that you work towards to achieve can disappear in a heartbeat with one breach, as we all know. So, so the cyber is a part of that tech equation as well. And then last but not least is the talent aspect of it, because, as we transform outside of specifically supply chain, but as organizations move towards more of a digital way of doing business, right? We're not competing just with other automotive companies or suppliers or OEMs. We're competing with Silicon Valley. We're competing with companies across every sector for the best and brightest talent. Because every company, and you've probably heard this, every company at the end of the day is either going to have to become a tech company or they won't exist, right? So in order for us to thrive, survive, revive, and then thrive, we have to really recruit the best talent. So we have to give these best and brightest people, show them that the automotive industry is a really cool place to work, where a lot of technical innovation is occurring. And we know that because we're inside. But it really is occurring. It's in fact one of the hotbeds of technology right now. From what was an old Rust Belt industry is now one of the most hottest technical, fields for innovation. So talent is the sixth piece of that puzzle. So those are the things I would leave the audience with, is that these are things to consider in order to build out resilience and thrive in the days to come.
I really appreciate that, Peter. I believe you gave our guests a lot to think about and consider, and really the panel overall, lots of good insights there. As we come to an end, I want to thank you all for joining us in this discussion. And please know that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on demand for viewing on the Infor Supply Chain Management landing page at our website.